The first time Diana laughed at him in public, Jesse felt the sting in his chest before he even registered the sound. They were in their living room, hosting one of those endless gatherings with couples from the bakery crowd. People Diana always insisted they entertain. Jesse had just finished showing his latest model train setup to Greg, a friend who'd asked about it with genuine interest. The tiny locomotives wound through meticulously crafted hills and tunnels, a world Jesse had spent months perfecting. It was his escape, his quiet rebellion against the chaos of life. But then Diana's voice cut through the room like a blade. God, Jesse, you're still playing with toys? What are you, 12? Her laugh was sharp, cruel, and it bounced off the walls like a ricochet. The room went quiet for a heartbeat, and Jesse could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his beer bottle clinking against the edge of the coffee table. Diana didn't stop. I mean, it's cute when you're a kid, but come on, you're a grown man. Shouldn't you be, I don't know, fixing the gutters or something useful? Jesse's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the heat rising in his face, but he didn't say anything. He never did. Instead, he focused on the model train set behind him, the tiny village he'd built piece by piece. The tracks gleamed under the soft light of his workshop lamp, the kind of detail only someone who cared would notice. But Diana didn't care. She never had. He could still remember the way she used to smile at him when they first met, back when she thought his hobbies were endearing. "It's so sweet," she'd said once, running her fingers over a miniature bridge he'd crafted. "You're so meticulous." Back then, it had sounded like a compliment. Now it felt like a weapon. The laughter died down eventually, replaced by the awkward hum of conversation as the group moved on to safer topics. The bakery, the weather, anything but Jesse's trains. He stayed by the table, pretending to adjust a tiny signal light, his hands trembling slightly. He could hear Diana's voice carrying across the room, louder than necessary, as if she wanted him to hear every word. "Honestly, I don't know why he bothers," she said to someone, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's not like it's going to make us any money." Jesse's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he thought about the hours he'd spent in his workshop, the quiet satisfaction of building something real, something tangible. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But Diana didn't understand that. She didn't understand him. As the night wore on, Jesse found himself retreating further into the background, a ghost in his own home. He watched Diana from across the room, her laughter ringing out like a bell, her gestures growing more animated with each glass of wine. She looked radiant, alive, and for a moment, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Was it jealousy, resentment, or just the slow, aching realization that they were drifting further apart every day? He didn't know. All he knew was that the sting in his chest wasn't going away. And as he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer felt like his, Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. The question was, would it be the trains or him? It was the kind of quiet afternoon that felt like the calm before a storm. Jesse was in the garage, tinkering with his toolbox, trying to distract himself from the tension that had been growing in the house. The air smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, a comforting smell that usually grounded him. But not today. Today it felt like the world was holding its breath. He just finished tightening a loose bolt on the workbench when he heard his son's voice from the living room. It was low, almost a whisper, but the tone carried, sharp and worried. Jesse froze, his hand still gripping the wrench. He wasn't the kind of man to eavesdrop, but something in his gut told him to stay quiet. "Mom's been meeting someone at the bakery late at night," his son was saying. "She thinks I don't know." The words hit Jesse like a punch to the chest. He felt the wrench slip from his hand, clattering onto the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the garage, but his mind was already racing, piecing together fragments of the past few months. Diana's late nights, the way she'd started dressing up to go to the bakery, even when it was just to check the inventory. The coldness in her eyes when she looked at him, like he was a stranger in his own home. The bakery key. It was always in her purse now, jingling softly whenever she moved. He'd noticed it weeks ago, but hadn't thought much of it. Now it felt like a symbol of everything he'd been ignoring. The key to her secrets. The key to his undoing. Jesse leaned against the workbench, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His toolbox sat open beside him, the tools neatly arranged, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling in his mind. He thought about the nights he'd stayed up waiting for her, the excuses she'd given, supplier meetings, late deliveries, inventory checks. He'd believed her. Or maybe he'd just wanted to. His son's voice broke through his thoughts again. "I don't know what to do," the boy said, his voice trembling. "She's acting weird, and Dad's just, I don't know. He doesn't even notice." Jesse's chest tightened. His son's worried expression flashed in his mind. The way the boy had been quieter lately, more withdrawn. He chalked it up to teenage moods, but now he saw it for what it was. A kid caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. The bakery. It had always been Diana's dream, her passion. Jesse had supported her, pouring his sweat and savings into making it work. Now it felt like a betrayal. The place she'd built with his help was now the stage for her lies. Jesse's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He wanted to storm into the house, demand answers, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of what he'd find. Maybe it was the realization that he'd been blind for too long. He glanced at the toolbox again, the neatly arranged wrenches and screwdrivers mocking him. He was a man who fixed things, who built things. But how do you fix something when the foundation is rotten? How do you rebuild when the pieces are already broken? The bakery key, the late nights, the coldness. It all added up to a truth he didn't want to face. Jesse closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but beneath that, something deeper. A weary resignation that had been building for months. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. The bakery wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was a battlefield, and Jesse was done being a spectator. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee and something sour, maybe the leftover takeout from last night that neither of them had bothered to clean up. Jesse stood near the counter, his fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. The crumpled hotel receipt sat in front of him, the ink smudged but still legible enough to read the date and time. It was the same day Diana had come home late, smelling faintly of cinnamon and something floral, her hair slightly disheveled. She'd laughed it off, saying she'd been working late at the bakery with the supplier. Diana stood across from him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of irritation. "What's your problem, Jesse?" "It's just a receipt. So what if I stayed late at the hotel?" "Sometimes you have to wine and dine suppliers to keep the business running." Jesse didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the knife block on the counter, the one they'd bought together when they first moved in, the one they'd used to cut their anniversary cake last year. He didn't reach for it, but it felt like it was there, sharp and gleaming, even when he wasn't looking at it. "You told me it was a business meeting," he said finally, his voice low and steady, though his chest felt like it was full of glass. "You told me you were at the bakery. But this..." He tapped the receipt with one finger. "This says you were at the Hilton. And you weren't alone." Diana's face twitched, just for a second, before she smoothed it back into that annoyed expression. "Oh, come on, Jesse. You're being paranoid. I told you it was work. I had to meet the supplier there because the bakery was closed. End of story." Jesse reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped through a few screens, then held it up to her. It was a text he'd found on her phone. Accidentally, he'd claimed, from a number he didn't recognize. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same room as last time." Diana's face went pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like a fish gasping for air. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the clock above the sink. "Who is he?" Jesse asked, his voice still calm, though his hands were shaking now. "The supplier? Or is he just some guy you've been sneaking around with behind my back?" Diana's shoulders slumped, and she leaned back against the counter, her arms dropping to her sides. "Jesse, it's not what you think," she said, her voice cracking. It just happened. He's been helping me with the bakery, with the debts. I didn't mean for it to go this far, I swear." Jesse stared at her, the words sinking in like a blade twisting in his gut. He'd known, deep down, that something was wrong. The late nights, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she'd started picking fights over nothing. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing her admit it, was like having the floor ripped out from under him. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Diana looked away, her tear-streaked face catching the light from the window. "A few months," she said quietly. "It didn't mean anything, Jesse. It was just stress. The bakery, the money, everything. I wasn't thinking straight." Jesse's hands clenched into fists, the nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to grab that knife, and no, he wouldn't. He couldn't. Instead, he just stood there, staring at her, feeling like the walls of the kitchen were closing in around him. "You were supposed to be my wife," he said finally, his voice breaking. "You were supposed to be the one person I could trust. And now I don't even know who you are." Diana started to cry in earnest then, her shoulders shaking as she slumped against the counter. "I'm sorry, Jesse," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know what else to do." Jesse didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the knife block, the receipt, the woman he'd thought he knew. And for the first time in years, he felt completely, utterly alone. The fluorescent light above Jesse's workbench flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the room. The smell of oil and sawdust clung to the air, familiar and grounding. His workshop had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world. Tonight, though, the quiet felt heavier, like the weight of everything Diana had done was pressing down on the walls. He sat on the stool, staring at the derailed toy train on the bench in front of him. The engine had come off the tracks, its tiny wheels still spinning uselessly in the air. Jesse reached out and stopped them with a calloused finger, his jaw tightening. It felt like a metaphor for his life. Everything had been running smoothly, or so he thought, until it wasn't. Until Diana had pushed it all off the rails. His eyes drifted to the corner of the bench, where a dust-covered wedding photo sat propped against a toolbox. He hadn't touched it in months, hadn't even looked at it. But now, he couldn't help but notice how the dust had settled into the grooves of the frame, how the glass had dulled under the grime. He picked it up, wiping a finger across the surface. Diana's smile stared back at him, bright and full of promise, the way it had been on that day. He remembered how she'd laughed when he dropped the ring during the ceremony, how she teased him about it for weeks afterward. That laugh, the one he used to love, now felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He set the photo back down, harder than he meant to, and the glass cracked faintly in one corner. A jagged line split Diana's face in two. Jesse stared at it for a long moment, then turned away. The workshop light buzzed faintly, the sound grating against his nerves. He got up and paced the small space, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. The anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it wasn't the kind that made him want to punch walls or scream. It was colder, sharper. A quiet, seething rage that made his hands itch to do something, to fix something. He stopped in front of the workbench again, his eyes landing on the derailed train. Slowly, he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The wheels were misaligned, and one of the connectors had come loose. He reached for his tools, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. As he worked, his mind began to clear, the fog of betrayal and hurt giving way to something else. Focus. Jesse had always been good with his hands. Fixing things, building things, it was what he knew. And right now, fixing this train felt like the only thing he could control. He tightened the screws, realigned the wheels, and set it back on the tracks. With a flick of a switch, the train whirred to life, moving smoothly along the rails. He watched it for a moment, the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels echoing in the quiet room. But the satisfaction didn't last. The train was fixed, but his life wasn't. And as much as he wanted to believe he could just put everything back on track, he knew it wasn't that simple. Diana's betrayal wasn't something he could hammer out or screw back together. It was deeper, messier, and it had left scars he wasn't sure would ever heal. He leaned back against the bench, his eyes wandering to the cracked wedding photo again. The anger flared, hot and sudden, and for a moment, he wanted to smash it, to destroy every reminder of what he'd lost. But he didn't. Instead, he picked it up again, staring at Diana's face. "You think you've won," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "You think I'm just going to sit here and let you ruin me." The train continued its loop around the tracks, the sound steady and constant. Jesse's grip tightened on the photo frame, his knuckles going white. He wasn't going to let Diana get away with this. He wasn't going to let her take everything from him. Not his son, not his life, not his dignity. He set the photo down again, this time face down on the bench. Then he turned back to the train, his mind racing. If Diana thought he was just going to roll over and take it, she was in for a rude awakening. Jesse had spent his life fixing things, and now he was going to fix this. But not tonight. Tonight he just needed to breathe, to think, to plan. The workshop light flickered again, and this time, Jesse reached up and turned it off, plunging the room into darkness. The train's wheels clicked faintly in the silence, the only sound in the room. He sat there in the dark, listening to it, letting the rhythm steady him. Tomorrow he would start. But tonight he just needed to survive. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, unassuming and white, the kind of thing you'd toss in the recycling without a second thought. But Jesse had been noticing the little things lately. The way Diana's voice tightened when she talked about money. The way she'd started locking her phone screen when he walked into the room. The way she'd been working late more often than not. So when the bank statement arrived, he opened it. Not out of suspicion exactly, but because the numbers didn't add up. He'd been keeping track in his ledger, the same one he used to balance the books for his side gig fixing up old cars. He liked things to line up, to make sense. Life was messy enough without the numbers lying to you too. The first thing that caught his eye was the withdrawal. $5,000, marked business expenses. That didn't make sense. Diana's bakery was supposed to be turning a profit, or at least breaking even. He flipped back through his ledger, the pages worn and smudged with grease from his fingertips. According to his notes, she'd taken out $3,000 the month before, and another $2,500 the month before that. All labeled the same way. Business expenses. His stomach dropped. He grabbed the rest of the mail, sifting through the stack until he found another statement. This one was from their joint savings account. The balance was $437.62. He blinked, his mind racing. They'd had over $20,000 in there just 6 months ago. That was their emergency fund, the money they'd set aside for their son's college tuition, for a rainy day. Now it was nearly empty, and he couldn't remember a single conversation about dipping into it. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in. He sat down at the table, his hands trembling as he spread the statements out in front of him. The numbers told a story, one he hadn't been paying attention to. Diana's bakery wasn't just struggling, it was hemorrhaging money, and she hadn't said a word about it. He thought about the late nights she'd been spending at the bakery, the way she'd been so quick to snap at him when he asked how things were going. He thought about the way she'd laughed at his model trains, calling them a waste of time. And then he thought about the supplier, the one she'd been meeting at the bakery after hours. The one she'd claimed was just helping her with inventory. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just about the affair. This was bigger, uglier. She'd been lying to him, stealing from him, and he'd been too blind, or maybe too trusting, to see it. He grabbed his ledger and started writing, his pen moving quickly across the page. He'd always been good with numbers, good at finding patterns. Now he used that skill to piece together the truth. The withdrawals, the missed payments, the unexplained expenses, it all added up to one thing. Diana had been using their money to cover her debts, and she'd been doing it behind his back. The anger came in waves, hot and sharp, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time for rage. This was the time to be methodical, to be careful. He needed evidence, not just suspicion. He needed to know exactly how deep this went. He opened the cabinet above the sink, where they kept their savings jar. It was supposed to be for loose change, the kind of thing you'd empty out for a vacation or a special treat. Now it was almost empty, just a few coins rattling around at the bottom. He stared at it for a long moment, the emptiness of it echoing the hollow feeling in his chest. Then he closed the cabinet, picked up his ledger, and got to work. He'd always been a man who believed in fixing things, in making them right. But this wasn't something he could fix with his hands. This was going to take patience and precision, and a kind of cold, calculating focus he didn't know he had. Diana had underestimated him. She'd thought he was too soft, too naive to notice what she was doing. But she was wrong, and by the time she realized it, it would be too late. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. Jesse sat in the living room, a half-finished model train car in his hands, his fingers absently tracing the grooves of the tiny wheels. He wasn't really working on it, just holding it, grounding himself in the familiar weight of it. The house smelled faintly of bleach and lemons, the kind of sterile cleanliness Diana always insisted on. It used to feel comforting. Now it just felt hollow. He wasn't sure why he'd wandered downstairs. Maybe it was the way the light had shifted in his workshop. The late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds in a way that made the dust motes look like they were suspended in amber. Or maybe it was the faint murmur of voices drifting up from the backyard. Diana's laugh cutting through the air like a knife. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He never did. But there was something about the way she laughed now, sharp, almost mocking, that made him pause. He moved to the window, the broken train wheel still clenched in his hand. Through the glass, he could see Diana and her friend, Lisa, sitting on the patio. Diana was leaning back in her chair, a glass of wine in one hand, her other hand gesturing wildly as she talked. Her voice carried, clear and unashamed, through the thin pane of glass. "It's almost too easy," Diana was saying, her tone dripping with something Jesse couldn't quite place. Amusement? Contempt? He's so predictable. Always tinkering with those stupid trains like they're gonna save him or something. And the best part? He'd never leave me. Not with Tommy in the picture. He'd stay forever. Just for him. Jesse's grip tightened on the broken wheel, the edges biting into his palm. He didn't feel the pain, not really. It was drowned out by the roaring in his ears, the kind of white noise that comes when the world tilts just enough to show you its true face. He stared at Diana's reflection in the window, her smug smile warping slightly in the glass, and for the first time he saw her clearly. Not as the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd built a life with, but as someone else entirely. Someone who saw him as a pawn, a means to an end. He glanced down at the broken train wheel in his hand, the tiny spokes twisted and bent. It was supposed to be part of a new set he'd been working on for Tommy, a gift for his son's birthday. But now, staring at it, he felt a strange kind of clarity. This wasn't just a broken piece of plastic. It was a symbol of everything he'd let slip through his fingers. His time, his pride, his sense of self. Diana's laughter rang out again, sharp and cutting, and Jesse finally let go of the wheel, letting it clatter onto the windowsill. He turned away from the window, his reflection fading as he stepped back into the shadows of the house. For the first time in months, he felt something other than numbness. It wasn't anger exactly. It was colder, sharper. Resolve. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done being the fool in Diana's story. She thought she had him trapped, thought she could keep him dangling on a string forever. She was wrong. And as he climbed the stairs back to his workshop, the broken train wheel left behind on the sill, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness, but for something better. Something real. The workshop door clicked shut behind him, and he sat down at his workbench, his hand steady as he reached for a new piece of track. He had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The bakery was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock above the counter. Jesse sat in the back office, his fingers tracing the edge of the voice recorder he'd bought 2 days ago. It was small, unassuming, but it felt heavy in his hand, like it carried the weight of everything he was about to hear. He'd left it tucked under a stack of invoices on Diana's desk earlier that morning, the red light barely visible beneath the papers. He hadn't planned this. Not really. But after weeks of sleepless nights and half-baked suspicions, he needed proof. Something solid. Something undeniable. He'd told Diana he was going to the hardware store to pick up supplies for a repair job. She hadn't even looked up from her phone when he left, her focus already elsewhere. Jesse had driven around the block twice before parking in the alley behind the bakery, slipping in through the back door like a ghost. Now he sat in the dim light of the office, waiting. The air smelled faintly of burnt sugar and yeast, a scent that used to bring him comfort but now just made his stomach turn. When the bell above the front door jingled, Jesse's breath caught. He recognized Diana's laugh immediately, light, carefree, the kind of laugh she hadn't directed at him in months. Then came the deeper voice, the one he'd heard on the phone a dozen times before. Him. Jesse clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms as he leaned closer to the recorder. "You're late," Diana said, her tone teasing. "Again." Traffic, the man replied, his voice smooth, confident. You know how it is. Jesse could picture them standing in the middle of the bakery, Diana leaning casually against the counter, her wedding ring glinting under the fluorescent lights. Except it wasn't there anymore. He'd noticed its absence weeks ago, though she'd claimed it was being resized. A lie like everything else. Did you bring the paperwork? Diana asked, her voice dropping slightly. Right here. There was the sound of rustling papers, then a soft thud as something heavy was set on the counter. Once we get Jesse to sign over his share, the bakery's ours. Free and clear. Jesse's chest tightened. Sign over his share? He'd never agreed to that. He'd never even discussed it. The bakery was supposed to be theirs, a family business they'd built together. But now, listening to Diana and this man, this stranger, talk about it like it was already a done deal, he felt like he was choking on the truth. He won't suspect a thing, Diana said, her voice tinged with something close to pity. He's so caught up in his little trains. He doesn't even notice what's going on around him. Jesse's jaw tightened. His trains. The one thing that had kept him sane these past few months, the one thing that felt like his. And she turned it into a joke, a weapon to use against him. Once the money's transferred, the man continued, we can cut him loose. He'll be too busy trying to figure out how to pay off the debts to come after us. Debts? Jesse's mind raced. What debts? He'd always been meticulous about their finances, balancing the books, making sure everything was in order. But now, listening to Diana and her lover talk about debts he knew nothing about, he felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. And the kid? The man asked, his tone casual, like they were discussing the weather. He'll come around, Diana said, her voice firm. Once he sees what a mess Jesse's made of everything, he'll understand. Jesse's hands shook as he reached for the recorder, his fingers hovering over the stop button. He wanted to storm out there, to confront them, to scream until his voice gave out. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, silent and still, as the truth settled over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal on every level, emotional, financial, even parental. Diana wasn't just leaving him. She was trying to take everything from him. His business, his son, his life. When the conversation finally ended, Jesse waited until he heard the door close and the lock click into place before he moved. He grabbed the recorder, his fingers trembling as he slipped it into his pocket. The bakery ledger sat open on the desk, its pages filled with numbers that didn't add up, with transactions he couldn't explain. He flipped through it quickly, his eyes scanning the rows of figures, the notes in Diana's handwriting. It was all there, laid out in black and white. The debts, the missing money, the lies. Jesse's wedding ring caught the light as he closed the ledger, the gold band feeling tighter than usual. He'd worn it every day for 15 years, through the good times and the bad. But now, as he stared at it, he felt nothing but emptiness. He slipped it off, setting it on the counter next to Diana's empty spot. Let her explain that. As he stepped out into the alley, the cold air hit him like a slap, sharp and bracing. He took a deep breath, his lungs filling with the crisp scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. The recorder in his pocket felt heavier now, a tangible reminder of what he'd just heard. But for the first time in months, Jesse felt something else, too. Something sharp and electric, like a spark igniting in the dark. It wasn't just anger. It was resolve. He had the proof. Now all he needed was a plan. The kitchen was too quiet, the way it always seemed to be now. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a low, steady drone that matched the tension in the air. Jesse sat at the table, the evidence folder in front of him, its edges slightly frayed from how often he'd flipped through it. He'd memorized every detail, every receipt, every text message, every recorded conversation. The weight of it all pressed against his chest, but he kept his face steady, his hands flat on the table. Diana walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She stopped short when she saw him. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to his face. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, but then she forced a smile, brittle and fake. Jesse, she said, her voice too light, too casual. You're home early. He didn't respond, just kept his eyes on her, unblinking. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Diana shifted her weight, her fingers twitching at her sides. She glanced at the folder again, and this time her smile faltered. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tighter now. Jesse leaned back in his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened the folder, the sound of the papers rustling unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't need to look at the contents. He knew them by heart. But he wanted her to see him doing it, wanted her to understand that he had everything. "Sit down, Diana," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. It was the kind of tone you'd use with a spooked animal, and it made her flinch. She hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. She was trying to keep her composure, but Jesse could see the cracks forming. Her breathing was uneven, her lips pressed into a thin line. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A hotel receipt, her name on it, clear as day. The date was from 2 weeks ago, when she told him she was meeting a supplier. Her eyes darted over it, and then she looked up at him, her face pale. "Jesse," she started, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like. I can explain." He cut her off, his voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now, sharp and cold. "Don't. Just don't." She flinched again, her hands moving to her lap, twisting together. Her wedding ring caught the light, a glint of gold that felt like a mockery now. Jesse's gaze lingered on it for a moment before he looked back at her face. She was trying to hide it, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the way her pulse jumped in her throat. "I know everything," he said, his voice low. "The hotel stays, the money, him." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it again. But then her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. Her trembling fingers twisted the ring, pulling it off and setting it on the table between them. The metal clicked softly against the wood. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was scared, Jesse. I didn't know what to do." He didn't respond, just watched her, his expression unreadable. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. He'd spent too many nights letting it eat him alive, and now it felt like a distant thing, something he could control. "Please," she said, tears spilling over. "I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he thought about the nights she'd come home late, smelling like coffee and someone else's cologne. The way she'd laughed at him in front of their friends, mocking the one thing that brought him joy. The way she'd lied, over and over, until the truth was so tangled he could barely see it. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice steady. "You made your choices, Diana. Now you'll live with them." She stared at him, her face crumpling as the reality of his words sank in. Her hands reached for his, but he pulled back, standing up from the table. The folder stayed where it was, a silent testament to everything she'd done. "Jesse," she begged, her voice desperate now. "Please, think about our son. Think about us." He paused, his back to her, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment, his resolve wavered, the image of their son's face flashing in his mind. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening. "I am thinking about him," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's why I'm doing this." And with that, he walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the kitchen, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a stone. The lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and desperation, a scent Jesse had grown uncomfortably familiar with over the past few months. He sat stiffly in the chair, the divorce papers spread out on the table in front of him like a battlefield map. His fingers traced the edge of the custody agreement, the weight of it heavier than any engine block he'd ever lifted. His son's name was on there, clear and unmistakable, and it hit him in a way he hadn't expected. Relief, yes, but also a strange, bitter ache. Relief because he knew he'd done everything to protect the boy. The ache, that was for the life he thought he'd built, the one that had crumbled like a rotten foundation. Diana sat across from him, her face pale and drawn, her usual confidence replaced by a hollowed-out version of herself. Her lawyer was spouting legal jargon, but Jesse barely listened. He didn't need to. He'd already won. The evidence he'd gathered, the recordings, the bank statements, the receipts, had done the talking for him. Diana's affair wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a calculated move to bleed him dry, to leave him with nothing but the ashes of their life together. But Jesse wasn't that man anymore. The man who'd let her mock his model trains, who'd swallowed his pride every time she rolled her eyes at him, was gone. In his place was someone harder, sharper, and, for the first time in years, unapologetically himself. When the papers were signed, Diana looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "You're really going to do this to me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Jesse didn't flinch. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and slid the custody agreement back into its folder. He'd heard those words before, in a dozen different ways, always aimed at making him feel small. Not this time. This time, he walked out of that office with his head high and the keys to his son's future in his hand. Back in his workshop, the model train set sat on the table, gleaming under the fluorescent light. He'd spent hours restoring it, painstakingly repairing every scratch, every broken piece. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that he could rebuild what had been broken. He ran his fingers over the smooth metal, the wheels clicking softly as he nudged the locomotive forward. It moved smoothly, perfectly, just like the plan he'd set in motion. Diana's lover wouldn't be so lucky. Jesse had made sure of that. The man's business was already crumbling under the weight of his own greed. His suppliers cutting ties one by one. Jesse hadn't done it out of spite, well, not just spite. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do. Because men like that didn't deserve to win. And neither did Diana. The workshop was quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt like peace. Jesse sat there for a long time, staring at the train set, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't quite name. Anger, yes, but also something softer, something that felt like hope. He'd done it. He'd taken back his life, piece by piece, and now he had everything that mattered. His son, his dignity, and, for the first time in years, his freedom. The workshop smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint, the kind of scent that carried memories of simpler times. Jesse sat cross-legged on the floor, a tiny brush in hand, carefully applying midnight blue to the side of a locomotive. His son, Liam, leaned over his shoulder, his breath warm and steady, watching with the kind of wide-eyed focus only a 9-year-old could muster. The radio played softly in the background, some old country tune Jesse's dad used to hum while tinkering in the garage. It was a sound that felt like home. "Dad, you missed a spot," Liam said, pointing to a corner of the train where the paint had thinned. Jesse smiled, not the tight-lipped kind he'd been forcing for months, but a real one that reached his eyes. "Good catch, buddy," he said, dipping the brush back into the paint. "You've got a sharp eye, just like your grandpa." The room was quiet except for the occasional clink of tools and the hum of the radio. Jesse glanced at the newly painted train model, its glossy finish catching the light from the overhead bulb. It was a far cry from the derailed mess he'd left untouched for weeks after the divorce. That train had been a symbol of everything falling apart. But this one felt like a fresh start. He'd built it from scratch, piece by piece, just like he was rebuilding his life. Liam picked up a tiny decal of a railroad crossing sign and held it up to the light. "Can we put this one here?" he asked, pointing to the front of the locomotive. Jesse nodded, handing him the tweezers. "Go for it, champ. Just take it slow." As they worked together, Jesse couldn't help but notice how much Liam had grown over the past year. His hands were steadier, his questions more thoughtful. He'd stopped asking where Mom was every night, and Jesse wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. He tried to shield Liam from the worst of it, but kids were smarter than adults gave them credit for. They noticed the late-night phone calls, the hushed arguments, the way Diana's voice had grown colder and sharper. Jesse had made a promise to himself never to badmouth Diana in front of Liam, no matter how much she deserved it. But some days it was harder than others. "Dad," Liam's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you happy now?" The question caught him off guard. Jesse set down the brush and looked at his son. Really looked at him. There were shadows under Liam's eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, but there was also a resilience Jesse hadn't noticed before. "Yeah, buddy," he said finally. "I'm getting there. Are you?" Liam shrugged, focusing on the decal he was carefully applying. "I think so. I like it better when it's just us. Mom always seemed mad." Jesse's chest tightened. He wanted to say something profound, something that would make all of this make sense for Liam, but the truth was, he was still figuring it out himself. Instead, he reached out and ruffled Liam's hair. "I like it better when it's just us two," he said. "And you know what? We're gonna be okay. We've got each other and we've got this." He gestured to the train set, now nearly complete. Liam grinned, and for a moment, Jesse saw a flash of the little boy who used to run around the house with a toy train in each hand, making choo-choo noises at the top of his lungs. "Can we paint the next one red?" Liam asked, his excitement bubbling over. "Red it is," Jesse said, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the workshop's heater. He glanced at the dust-covered wedding photo still sitting on the shelf in the corner, untouched since the day Diana had left. For the first time, he didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal when he looked at it. It was just a photo, a relic of a life that didn't exist anymore. He'd survived worse. As the final decal was placed and the train set gleamed under the workshop light, Jesse felt a quiet sense of pride. Not just in the model they'd built together, but in the life they were rebuilding piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.